The man called the world's most influential public intellectual is in the country right now speaking to tens of thousands of people in sold-out shows across Australia. Last week he spoke to a sizable group of MPs in Canberra, including the likes of Jacinta Price, Andrew Hastie and Matt Canavan. When I sat down with Dr Peterson, I began by asking, how do Conservatives effectively communicate their vision and start fighting back instead of apologising?
Yeah, well, Conservatives are pretty good at implementing. That's their strength, even on the temperamental side. But on the vision front, they're not that good. And that's partly what even makes them conservative, because if you're a conservative, you don't need a vision in some sense, because what you tend to do is walk the tried and true path. And in some sense, that's a replacement for a vision, or it's a traditional vision. And the disadvantage you have, I would say, on that front is that when people push you in relationship to your traditional vision, you may not be able to articulate it well. So someone might object to someone who's conservative. It's like, well, defend marriage. It's like, well, people think, well, I thought we already agreed on that. I don't know how to defend that. It's an institution that's been around for all intents and purposes forever. It's part of the general consensus of value. Even to articulate it to that degree is rare. And so conservatives are often taken aback, especially when those questions are also accompanied by a moral accusation. Like, well, you know, it's nothing but a patriarchal institution. And it's also easy to make conservatives feel guilty because they're conscientious. Yeah. And so if you tell a conservative, you're not doing your duty, they think, oh, well, I'm not. I'm trying to do my duty.
But the Conservatives have for a long time almost vacated the field when it comes to the so-called culture wars. And we have seen the left's march. It's not just through academia anymore. It's in private institutions. It's in corporations, Hollywood. So is it far too advanced for there to be a correction or a reversal?
No, there will eventually be a reversal. The question is, how much intervening damage are we willing to sustain before that correction occurs? And the answer is, you know, people say, well, the pendulum swings back. It's like, yeah, sometimes when it swings back, it has razor's edge. And it takes a lot of people with it when it's swinging. You know, Venezuela will eventually correct course, but how many people will die as a consequence? So that's not a useful solution. What's the solution? Do you have something to say that you're not saying? If you do, then it's your fault. This is your fault. It's your problem. And you might say, well, I'm too afraid to talk. It's like, fair enough. How afraid are you not to talk? You know, people say to me frequently, they compliment me on my bravery. And I think, you don't understand. I'm not brave. I don't like conflict. I'm way more afraid of losing control of my tongue than I am of the consequences of saying what I have to say. Because I know what happens when we allow other people to control our tongues. It's not good. It's not good. It's hell itself. And so, of course, it's troublesome to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune when you say what you have to say. It's like, that's fine. Try not saying what you have to say. Well, that'll be okay in the moment. It's like, yeah, in the moment. But unfortunately, your whole life isn't in the moment.
No, but you can understand. Like, I think I can understand why people still hesitate, whether there's someone with profile or someone who's just on a Facebook page and they don't want to state even a very mainstream opinion that's not progressive, because there's a real cost there. And is the cost worth saying what you feel?
Yeah, well, that's one of the fundamental questions of life. Is that, well, so we have a sense in the West, there's a doctrine in the West, very central doctrine. It's associated with the idea of logos and the divine word. The truth will set you free. Well, true or false? You might say, well, if I say the truth, I'm going to get into trouble. Fair enough, but if you abide by the lie, you're also going to get into trouble. And so one of the things you can do instantly is disabuse yourself of the notion that there's a zero trouble pathway. It's like, you're in trouble both ways, like real trouble. You get to pick your trouble. That's all you've got. I have been struck by the degree to which the vision on the centrist front is not neither compelling nor coherent. It's not, especially in the face of this tremendously pointed accusatory assault. It's all about power. And the only reason you don't see that is because of your privilege. It's like, well, you have privilege. I mean, you're in a good position. Do you not have privilege? Well, what do you mean privilege exactly? Did you earn it? Well, can you even earn privilege? Is there such a thing as earning it? Well, these are all questions that have been thrown up by people who are subsidized to do nothing but cause trouble as a consequence of their envy.
Now, you have an enormous impact with young men, and I speak to mothers of young men, and so many of them, whatever their political persuasion, are really concerned about the crisis amongst boys, the anti-male sentiment that we hear so much about in popular culture, toxic masculinity, male privilege, all these sort of negative messages. How do we counter that? What would be your message to mothers and young boys?
Part of what you do is you counter that in the home first, to the degree that a mother might be motivated by a resentful quasi-feminist ethos. That's going to manifest itself in her son's life. It's like, well, I'm antagonistic to the patriarchy. Okay, so what do you mean by that? The patriarchy, is that a manifestation of the central spirit of masculinity? Or what is it? Because if it's not that, then what is it? Well, let's say it's that. Well, your son's masculine, so how do you think your attitude towards masculinity is going to work for him? You're going to treat him like he's a baby patriarchal oppressor, or that his ambition is part of the force that rapes and pillages the planet? And that's sort of, that idea sort of lurking at the basis of all your interactions with him? You think that's going to go well? That's the devouring mother from the Freudian perspective. That's not going to go well. And so it's good to remember, if you're a mother, when you talk about the patriarchy, you're talking about your son.
But even in boys' schools, even in education centres that are supposed to be devoted to good outcomes for boys, there is just so much unrelenting messaging about toxic masculinity and male privilege. I just wonder, what impact does that have on young men growing up?
We know what impact it has on them. They just drop out. Why wouldn't they? Because, so imagine they're actually ethical, their boys are ethical in their fundamental orientation. So then they hear that their desire to engage in rough and tumble play, their desire to point and shoot at things, for example, which is deeply masculine, deeply human for that matter, because we point and shoot and aim at things. That's our entire physiological platform. We're hunting creatures, and that all. So your ambition is nothing but a manifestation of the corrupt and oppressive patriarchy. And as I said, you're part of the force that destroys the planet. If you have a shred of ethical sense and you're a young man, that's just going to stop you. It's going to just demotivate you. And in some sense, that's the purpose, because women who are afraid of men confuse competence with power, and then they believe that the road to peace is the antagonism to power, and because they don't discriminate between power and competence, they become antagonistic to their son's competence, and then they reap exactly what they sow. They end up with incompetent boys. Well, what went wrong? It's like, well, how about you discouraged every sign of competence, every chance you had? I read this account a while back. A woman author in the United States, whose name I don't remember, talked about just how difficult it was to stop her son from playing with guns. She said, well, I took every gun out of the house, or even anything that remotely looked like a gun, and that boy, he'd take the toothbrush and shoot the cat with it. And how appalling is that? It's like, oh, you're quite the monster, aren't you? You saw something manifest in your son that was so deep, this desire to point and shoot, let's say, that despite your best efforts, you couldn't crush it. And then you didn't even notice that you were spending all that time trying to crush it. And it was so deep that you couldn't, and you still regarded what you were doing as a virtue. It's like, boy, your son, he certainly needs a new mother. That's for sure.
And the world's richest man saying he wants to restore truth to Twitter and trust to Twitter. Yeah. It's the public square now. It's how people communicate, find news. You were personally impacted by Twitter's left-leaning, censorious ways. You've now been restored. What impact do you think Twitter becoming an even playing field will have for...
Who knows? I mean, I'm hoping I know people who know Elon Musk very well, who've worked for him, and these are very able people, to say the least. And they really admire him. He has the ability to do exactly what he did. He went into Twitter and he said, he's a good observer of the Pareto principle. A small minority of people do all the productive work. It's like, all you people, you're gone. And he just does it. It's like, and everybody who's whiny and complaining whines and complains about that, and no doubt some people who were doing a credible job were also let go, because it's a pretty broad swath, let's say. But he's got rid of 75% of the people, and Twitter is still working.
With record traffic.
Right, exactly. And so I think he will, and apparently he's also put the boots to the people who are trafficking in child sexual exploitation already.
Incredible.
2 weeks. Right, no kidding. No kidding. Incredible in two ways. Incredible that he did it, but even more incredible that he could do it that fast and that it hadn't been done. Right, right. So, and Musk also, it seems to me that the evidence is quite clear that he not only has a pretty good eye, but he is capable of learning. So he'll experiment, and he'll learn from his experiments, and we'll see if he can clean up Twitter. That's tough. I'm afraid, deeply afraid, that virtualization enables psychopathy, and that might be a fatal problem socially as we move towards a more virtualized world. It's not easy to keep the Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic sadists under control. They're a small proportion of the population, but it's all about them and their short-term needs, and they'll do anything to make those paramount. It looks to me that when we virtualize the world, we take all the constraints off those people, and that's not good. So, for example, on social media, all the power's in the hands of the accusers. Wow, that's not good. You know, believe all women. It's like, yeah, fair enough, except it's believe most women. As soon as it's all, it's like, yeah, well, what about the psychopaths? Oh, well, they don't exist. It's like, oh, you wouldn't say that if you ever met one. So if you think that all people who are malevolent are only victims, you're naive and fortunate, and you better wake up, because one of these days someone like that's going to come and knock on your door, and you are going to be one sorry person.
Do you think what we did during COVID could usher in our version of a social credit system?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, that's highly probable.
And that it will be accepted by many people, because again, that
they won't even
yearning
notice.
For safety.
They won't notice even. Yeah. You can't believe how much people don't know these things. When I went to the UK, I talked to some people from the House of Lords. This is within the last 6 months. The most astute of the people sitting in the House of Lords had only become aware of the woke movement in the last 18 months. Oh yes, you just can't believe how much this is not on people's radar. Not someone like you can't believe that at all, because it's on your radar all the time. That's not, you live in a world that's on the cutting edge of this sort of thing. It's like, people have no idea. It's like, well, why not have a digital passport? I mean, you know, how convenient. It's like, fair enough, and you can understand that. Wouldn't it be nice if we could pay for everything with our phones? It's like, wouldn't it be nice if the central government, who's woke-oriented and makes carbon dioxide remediation the priority, knows exactly what you spend on everything, so they can target you tax-wise with precision? It's like, oh, didn't think about that. It's like, yeah, you sure didn't. And oh yes, it's highly probable. It'll be a miracle if we escape from that. You can see these signs of this everywhere. You know, when you go through airports now, there's a lot of automated barriers. You show your passport. It's like, well, these are automated barriers. What if you can't go through them? Well, that's the situation for many people in China. It's like, what are you going to do? You're going to argue with the machine? Like, you just cannot imagine how screwed you are. There isn't, it's way worse than anything Kafka ever imagined, because at least with Kafka, there was bureaucrats. Faceless though they may have been, they were at least still human. Once the machines can lock you out, you are in such trouble. And we're speeding towards that with an immense lack of of care.
Jordan Peterson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for the interview.